There, that's much better.
Hi, my name is Christian Devine and welcome to Retro View. I know it's been a while since we've last checked in. There's been a lot going on in the world, and sometimes talking about physical media feels a bit trivial in the face of such strife and struggle. But art is one of the things that makes us strive and struggle. And we all can express ourselves, and it's a form of therapy, I believe, individual and collective. And it's also interesting that a few months after I started this channel, that there's been a nice kind of zeitgeist about physical media, to the point of Guillermo del Toro making an impassioned plea for people to hold on to their physical media as part of our DNA. It's also part of our archive as a civilization, and that's why it's important to hold on to these cultural artifacts, I believe, also to show people who we are, who we were, who we hope to be, etc., etc. And I'll add some music under that to make it sound even more stirring. And so one of the great releases of the year to me is this brand new Ultra HD 4K version of my favorite Alfred Hitchcock film. Not the best Alfred Hitchcock film, I'm going to argue, just my personal favorite. And that would be 1948's Rope.
What happened to David Kentley changed my life completely, and the two who were responsible for everything, Brandon Shaw and Philip Morgan.
Hitchcock's first color film, and his first film starring James Stewart, who he would make 4 more films with. The Man Who Knew Too Much, Rear Window, Vertigo. And Rope is even more interesting because it was also an experiment in trying to capture the immediacy and suspense of a stage play, which Rope is based off of. And so Hitchcock filmed Rope, as many of you know, in long takes that were 10-minute reels in the camera. So he would move into an object and then cover that up at the 10-minute point, and pretty cleverly, I feel, and I don't find it particularly noticeable, and even more so now because I'm so engaged by the story and the action. Now, Alfred Hitchcock has always been a huge influence on me aesthetically, and I've learned so much about filmmaking and storytelling from his movies. And William Friedkin says you can learn everything about filmmaking from watching Alfred Hitchcock films, and I totally agree and see what he's talking about, because the way Hitchcock shoots and edits and frames scenes is very composed and almost like a graphic novel. He has a very silent film technique of using visuals to convey emotions instead of dialogue, even though he's, contrary to some popular beliefs, he's very good with actors and gets fantastic performances from actors in his films. And so I really just was fascinated by Hitchcock for a long period and went through all of his films, and even slipped in an Alfred Hitchcock reference to the game that I wrote for Life is Strange. A very appropriate reference, but the power of Hitchcock's work is such that even today, as I'm doing this, the Criterion Channel has a whole holiday Hitchcock series, and they're also showing Rope, so it's a perfect time for you to get a chance to watch it. I haven't checked out their version of it, but it looked like it's probably based off this 4K, but it may not be. I'm not completely sure. Don't quote me on that. But nonetheless, it's a great way for you to preview Rope, and if you do love it, as a lot of you I think will, then you'll definitely want to pick up this 4K, because this version won't break apart or have any artifacts or stop in mid-picture. unless there's some bad quality control on discs, which definitely does happen and is kind of more the norm, sadly, these days. And so they've also released Hitchcock's Topaz and a few other films on 4K that are definitely worth checking out. I just watched Topaz for the first time, in fact, just to see it streaming on how it looked on UHD. And I did watch Torn Curtain also, which looked once again really beautiful, just even streaming. And Torn Curtain is highly recommended just for the murder scene in it. It's probably Hitchcock's last great set piece, and the actor who plays the victim is absolutely fantastic in the film. They also released The Man Who Knew Too Much, the Jimmy Stewart version, in 4K, and I looked at that, and that looks gorgeous. And that's not one of my favorite Hitchcocks, but there's a lot of things about it that I really like. Actually, I think Doris Day is quite wonderful in it, and she's quite an amazing actor in it. And as much as I love Jimmy Stewart in Rope, I don't really like him in The Man Who Too Much because he's just playing this kind of bumbling, rather ugly American. But there's some great set pieces, and once again, it looks the best I've ever seen it look, these films. And that's the great thing about 4K. And even Robert Harris, the restoration expert, said these films look twice as good as they've ever looked. And I've been waiting for Rope to come out in a very proper remaster since the very first time I saw it on a VHS copy. And I always knew it could look better. And over the years, it's never looked particularly great. This is never going to look better than it does now, this 4K. If they come out with an 8K version, it would mean that you're actually there at the dinner party. That's the only way it could look better. So my job was, I almost started crying, aesthetic tears of joy, because I was like, wow, this looks better than it did even in the theater when it came out. So I don't want to oversell it, but I'm telling you, it looks, even if you don't like the movie, it looks fantastic. Now, why is Rope my favorite Alfred Hitchcock film? I'm always interested in artists' unique outre works. I'm an expert on the Otto Preminger film Skidoo, his 1968 psychedelic disaster piece, upon which we will talk in a completely other retro view. But it's not something about, oh, it's so bad, it's good. It's just something culturally interesting, something going on in the filmmaking or the point of view, etc., etc. And even though Hitchcock said that Rope was a failed experiment, I completely disagree for a lot of reasons. He did, I think, capture the immediacy and suspense of a stage play, and the play was written in the 1920s by an author named Patrick Hamilton. And Rope was based on a very famous murder case called the Leopold Loeb murder case, and you can read about it into more detail. But basically, two teenagers, very elite, decided to take the life of a young boy to prove their superiority. And of course they were caught, and there was quite a public spectacle about the trial. And by the time it came to the screen in 1948, it was much more, kind of about proto-fascism. And the screenwriter, Arthur Loren, was very famously openly gay and no bullshit, no nonsense kind of, writer and person. And you can see interviews or read his memoirs and hear stories about him to this day. He was the co-writer of West Side Story and has a lot of credits to his name. And the important thing about Rope is also one of the most subversive things, and the things, of course, that I love about it and others do, is that it has, two characters who are clearly partners, two male characters, at a time when you couldn't even say or imply this with any characters unless it was the most horrible stereotype or caricature. And so Hitchcock knew clearly what he was doing, but everything had to be placed in the subtext. And though anybody watching the film today, or probably even then, could immediately pick up on what was going on. And the thing also that I like about the film, and I'm not the expert on the LGBTQ representation in Rope, and there's lots of other resources to check out by people who know more and can go into greater detail about what this film represents or doesn't. But what I like about Rope is that the characters are not presented as homicidal because they're gay. That's not what they're about. It's different. It's their elitism, their superiority. In this world, they are very accepted and very superior and have a very elite place. And of course, that's not necessarily how that would play out in society, especially in 1948, where you would be thrown in jail for, publishing poetry about, being gay, etc. So this is a very subversive film, and no less an expert than John Waters loves the film, and he also loves the film for one of the reasons I do, which is that the set. And John Waters says that the apartment in Rope is one of the greatest sets in movie history, and I completely agree. It's this beautiful, spacious New York dream apartment with this fantastic view of this wonderful, surrealistic New York skyline. And this is Hitchcock, to me, at his very surrealistic best, because he was very much influenced by Expressionism, German Expressionism. So there's always an element of surrealism to Hitchcock's work where you can sense that the backgrounds are not real or the environment is not real. And sometimes it's, it can just be bad, 50s rear projection, but a lot of times it's very clearly intended. And Rope, it does not look like a real city, but it's a glorious Toho-like city that changes from, day to night over the course of the events of the party. And spoiler alert, I am going to talk about some of the plot details. I simply have to talk about the details of the film. So, but watch it, come back. So basically the plot of Rope is about these two elite prep students who are probably too old to be prep students. John Dahl and Farley Granger play the leads, Brandon and Philip respectively. And they murder their friend and hide his body in a trunk, and then invite the parents over and his fiancée to a dinner party. And they also invite their old prep school professor, and played by James Stewart, of course. And he's the one that immediately figures out that something is up. And so the entire play happens in a real-time scenario, and it is a great cat and mouse, and very macabre when you start thinking about the implications of people eating around the body of the actual relatives and fiance. Very Hitchcockian, and very macabre. And one thing I love about Rope is that it really is a film about ideas also. So there's a lot of, I'm a sucker for films with characters engaged in existential debates about issues. And there's a theatricality, of course, about Rope that's built into the DNA of it, and I love it for that. And John Dahl, who plays the ringleader of the murder, Brandon Shaw, he's really underrated as far as I'm concerned in terms of the pantheon of Hitchcock villains, and he is probably one of the most self-satisfied characters in movie history.
I've always thought it was out of character for David to drink anything as corrupt as whiskey.
Out of character for him to be murdered, too.
Yes, wasn't it? Good Americans usually die young on the battlefield, don't they?
He's always got this internal pleasure at his own words and deeds going on, and I just absolutely love it. And you love to kind of hate him because he is such a condescending, superior, bastard. And of course, he's very charming also. And his partner, Philip, played by Farley Granger, who would also be in Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, is, much more weak and at the manipulative will of Brandon, although he does eventually show a spine towards the end of the film. And so their relationship is fascinating, particularly the way they have to code everything in the film. And the murder in the beginning is almost like this kind of sexual act, the way it's played out, and somewhat obvious too. The film also really does deal with class issues, and it's fascinating in the way the characters relate to each other and the way the maid particularly is treated by the guests and her employers. And so it's very interesting to see how that plays out in the film, and that kind of ties in with the theme of superiority or inferiority. And so there is this element, like I said, of critique of fascism. And of course, World War II had just ended just a few years earlier, so the idea of deposing and dealing with fascism was very fresh in the American mind, and certainly in this film's mind. I also really like the way it creates kind of this very late 40s New York elite vibe. And Joan Chandler plays the fiancée of the murdered victim, and I really like her, and she calls everybody chum. And you can kind of sense that these characters did have this kind of college relationship, and I think that's kind of a fun element of the film that it captures really well. And of course, James Stewart is the professor, and Rupert, and even though he always thought he was miscast, I completely disagree. I think this is one of my favorite, this is one of my favorite James Stewart performances. I think he's absolutely fantastic in the film. And he's kind of playing this William Faulkner-esque, Midwestern, smart-ass professor. And I can completely see him playing this part. He's not so much of an academic as he is just, very aware. And I don't think the film undersells his intellectual nature. Now, originally Hitchcock wanted Cary Grant or Montgomery Clift, who would be probably a little more closer to the kind of subversive nature of the film, because then it would have implied that the professor had a relationship with one of the characters. And in this case, you wouldn't necessarily pick that up from James Stewart, which is something that Arthur Lorenz criticized, but Arthur Lorenz criticized everything. It's okay. The fact is that James Stewart is quite wonderful. He's very funny. He's always got kind of this little smart-ass comment to everybody, puts everybody immediately on their toes, and livens up the party, as Brandon knew he would by inviting him. And Brandon's also a complete sociopath, so of course he would invite the one person who would figure out what they had done. And as Jimmy Stewart figures out what's happened, or what he thinks has happened, his attitude and demeanor go from this aloof smartass to kind of shocked righteousness. And when he finally discovers the body, it's one of my favorite absolute moments in any Hitchcock film. It's just a great visual of Stewart looking down. And particularly in the 4K, you really, all the lighting, which is almost Baba-esque in terms of the color palette, really stands out. And that's why the film really looks spectacular, because you really see how much of the color in the backdrop is doing a lot of the emotive, doing visual storytelling and emotive storytelling, and highlighting kind of the emotional state of the characters as the evening gets more emotional. And I love John Dahl, the way he tries to cover the tracks of everything he's done, his constant lying and trying to cover up, and even saying, oh, Philip's an alcoholic, I don't want to tell you, just when he's been caught. And it feels very real, that kind of sociopathic, just nonstop lying, even in the face of being caught. And I do a pretty good, I would say, impersonation of Jimmy Stewart at the end of the film when he confronts Brandon, but I won't do it here. You'll have to buy me a drink or ask me over for dinner. And it is one of my favorite visual Hitchcocks, and it is fun to see what he does with the camera and how clever he is and moving the camera around and even getting angles on things that are important. And there's just moments where you see Jimmy Stewart listening and watching, and you know what he's thinking. And Hitchcock is an underrated master of that kind of reactive shot of somebody figuring something out or looking, and you kind of know exactly what they're supposed to be thinking. So that's why I love Rope. And let's talk about this beautiful 4K. That cover is about as bland as they could possibly make it. I would have preferred the original poster, of course, not saying it's so much more dynamic or dramatic, but it represents what this film is. And this is a pretty bare bones deal in terms of extra features. There's a documentary, which is really good documentary, and there's a trailer which shows a scene that's not in the movie where you see the murder victim with his girlfriend in the opening scene. I'm not sure if that was filmed specifically for the trailer or not, but Hitchcock did that a lot. He would film specific footage for trailers, but it's a neat artifact anyway. And of course it looks like a VHS tape from when I first saw Rope. So it's amazing how crappy the quality is for these things, and I wish there was a little more care and, effort put in with digging some extra things up, because I'm sure a company like Arrow or Indicator, et cetera, would find a lot more to do with Rope, and even Criterion, who hopefully will get a chance to do something with Rope. But I'm not going to complain, because this really is gorgeous. It looks absolutely fantastic, and I can't stress enough how wonderful it is to have the film looking this visually stunning. And the sound is nothing spectacular. It's just a basic 2.0 mono, but it's fine. It looks great. Sounds great. There is this slip cover for those of you who are very excited about slip covers. To me, it's just a waste of paper, frankly, because this is a very strong box, it seems like, and so I don't really need that. And inside the disc, there's two discs, of course. There's the 4K, and then there's the download disc, and there's that, if you could see any of that. It's only taken decades for Rope to be released in a format that to me seems compatible with the nature of the film, and I think this particular release is going to bring in a whole new generation and other people into the fold of fans of the film, because it really is fun to watch. It's very short, and the subtext is right there in front of your face now, and there's engaging performances, a fantastic set design, Hitchcockian macabre atmosphere, and just a wonderful example of Hitchcock at his experimental best. So he said it was a failed experiment, but in this case he was wrong, and the film actually did make money. It made about almost $2 million. It cost around $1 million, made about $2 million. So for 1948, that's pretty good. That was Hitchcock's first film under his own company, and so that was a good start. And the relationship with Jimmy Stewart was obviously a good start, and Hitchcock's relationship with color was a great start, and he would meet Robert Burks, and soon enough who would become his color master for films. So Universal is to be commended for this release, bare bones as it is, and you can pick it up for a song as part of the 4K set or individual, and so I highly advise you to grab this and get a cocktail and have some friends over for dinner. So thank you for retro viewing. Please like and subscribe. or I'll have you over for dinner.